I was at a dinner party a few weeks ago. The host, he's one of those guys everyone loves. Incredibly charming, a natural storyteller, the kind of colleague everyone regards as a generous, caring family man. His wife and kids were there. The whole scene was perfect, warm, like something from a catalog. But then I watched what happened when his wife gently contradicted him on a small, insignificant point. I think it was about what year they'd bought their house. The shift was almost invisible. To everyone else, he just smiled, gave a little laugh, and corrected her. But I was sitting at an angle where I could see his face clearly. For just a fraction of a second before that charming smile locked back into place, his expression turned absolutely ice cold. It was a look of such profound dismissal that it was almost shocking. And his wife, she just wilted. She didn't argue back. She just looked down at her plate and was quiet for the rest of the conversation. 10 seconds later, he was the life of the party again, telling another hilarious story. And nobody else saw it. That moment, that perfect deception. That's the thing about this kind of violence. It leaves no visible traces, at least none that others can see. And, that perfect deception, that invisible violence, that is really what we are here to unpack today. Our mission for this deep dive is to explore the psychological, the behavioral, and maybe even the neurobiological stuff behind this subtle but honestly incredibly destructive phenomenon. It's so often linked to narcissistic personality disorder, NPD. Yeah.
We want to understand the wiring, I guess, and the environment that shapes a person capable of that kind of sudden, chilling shift.
Yeah, that story, it really hits home because it captures the core challenge, doesn't it? Yeah. We're looking at a form of profound psychological violence that often exists entirely below, the public radar.
Completely hidden.
Exactly. It's hard to define, hard to prove, and just immensely damaging. This invisible violence often gets called subtle or covert abuse, SCA for short, and it's directly connected to these really deep deficits in empathy.
Right.
So to truly get why that moment of dismissal was so cold and why it has such an impact, we have to explore what's happening inside in the brain of someone with narcissistic traits that sort of prevents genuine emotional connection. Yeah. And then we'll trace this pattern of behavior back, look at its complex roots in early life experiences, the developmental wounds that kind of forge this very defended, very self-centered personality. Okay, let's dig into this then. Before we can really grasp the insidious damage this subtle abuse causes, we probably need to get the foundations right. We need to define empathy properly, and then maybe carefully map out the different faces of narcissism that lead to these problems.
Absolutely. That's the right place to start. Empathy. It's not simple at all, is it? It's a complex kind of multidimensional process. Involves multiple brain regions working together.
Right.
When researchers try to dissect it, they generally break it down into two main domains, you could say.
Okay, what are those two domains?
So first, you've got the affective domain. This is more the emotional resonance bit, the ability to genuinely sort of co-experience or feel what others are feeling, often called affective sharing.
Like you see someone stub their toe and you physically wince.
Exactly. Or, a friend is super happy and you actually feel a bit of that joy yourself. Genuinely, it's that sort of visceral, maybe hardwired connection that lets us mirror and share emotional states.
So it's not just understanding that they're sad, it's feeling a kind of echo of that sadness inside yourself.
Precisely. Then the second domain is the cognitive domain. This is more intellectual, analytical. It's the ability to imagine and understand what others might be feeling, what their intentions are, their desires, even if you don't personally feel the same emotion. This is what psychologists sometimes call mentalizing, or having a theory of mind. You don't necessarily feel what they feel, but you can logically figure out their internal state, maybe guess their motives, understand why they're acting a certain way.
And that distinction feels really important here because presumably someone with narcissistic traits might have one but not the other, which could allow them to be, say, manipulative without actually connecting emotionally.
That's a really key insight, yes. Narcissism often involves deficits across both domains, but it's the deficits in affective empathy, that genuine co-experiencing of emotion, that tend to be the most severe. Narcissistic individuals can sometimes retain a pretty functional level of cognitive empathy. They can understand how others feel, often well enough to manipulate them effectively.
Right, they can read the room.
They can read the room, but without that emotional break, that affective empathy slowing them down or making them care.
Okay, now let's tackle narcissism itself. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot, maybe too easily, which is why I guess we need those two main axes of distinction you mentioned to bring some clarity.
Absolutely essential. Because the spectrum of narcissistic traits is just so broad, we really do need to categorize it along two essential axes to make sense of it. The first axis deals with severity.
Severity, okay.
This separates what we might call healthy narcissism from clinical or pathological narcissism, which is NPD.
What does healthy narcissism even look like? Is it actually healthy or maybe just functional?
That's a good question. It's definitely functional. Healthy narcissism usually involves high self-esteem, a pretty strong sense of entitlement to good outcomes, and often quite high ambition. It correlates with things like strong leadership skills, a higher chance of career success. These folks are self-confident, often charming.
The successful CEO type, maybe?
Could be.
Yeah.
And crucially, while they might still have lower interpersonal empathy, maybe seem a bit self-centered, they don't typically inflict systematic, lasting damage on people around them in the same way. Their self-perception, while high, is generally more grounded in reality, more flexible.
So ambitious, maybe a bit self-focused, but not necessarily destructive or delusional.
Exactly. But then you move across that spectrum to the clinical type narcissistic personality disorder, or NPD. This is defined in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual, by a really fixed, pervasive pattern of, well, delusions of self-importance, a desperate, excessive need for admiration, and this profound lack of empathy that just really messes up relationships.
It's the rigidity that's key.
The rigidity, the pervasiveness, the inability to handle contradiction without that internal system going haywire, that's what marks the clinical pathology.
And the second axis. That describes how it presents itself, which seems vital for understanding the subtle abuse we started with.
Yes, the second axis is presentation. This divides people into the grandiose, or overt type, and the vulnerable, or covert type.
Okay.
The grandiose type is the one most people picture, I think. The classic narcissist. High extroversion, massive self-confidence, exhibitionism, and often quite aggressive if they feel challenged.
Loud, commanding, needs the spotlight, like the host in the story, potentially.
Could be, yeah. They often embody that charming life of the party persona, but with that underlying edge. The person everyone perhaps sees as a bit much, but often incredibly successful, magnetic even.
Right, and the vulnerable type.
The vulnerable type, on the other hand, is much quieter, subtler.
Right.
They often present as introverted, highly anxious, actually have pretty low self-esteem underneath it all, and they are incredibly sensitive to feeling slighted or criticized.
So the opposite presentation, almost.
Almost entirely opposite on the surface. They're the brooding, sensitive type who needs constant reassurance, maybe passive attention. They get their narcissistic supply, that validation they crave, by being seen as wounded or exceptionally sensitive, drawing pity or perhaps caregiving from others.
Wow, so the outward mask is completely different, but you're saying the engine underneath, the core issue, is basically the same.
It is. And this is the crucial link between them. Whether the person is grandiose and loud or vulnerable and quiet, the core traits that define all subtypes are selfishness, extreme self-centeredness, a real disregard for others' needs and feelings, and critically, that low affective empathy.
They're all just protecting something fragile inside.
Yeah, absolutely. They're all fundamentally defensively focused on protecting an extremely fragile internal self-image.
That deep vulnerability, coupled with the low empathy, that brings us right back to the kind of violence we opened with. Subtle or covert abuse SCA. How does that behavior actually show up, and why is its subtle nature so powerful and hard to spot?
Yeah, the link between the narcissistic patterns and the abuse is critical, especially when we look at the subtle end of things. Subtle or covert abuse, SCA, is defined as the indirect use of things like threat, force, intimidation, or aggression.
But indirect.
How? It's communicated not through, fists or shouting, but through manipulation, veiled criticism, maybe humor used as a weapon, or withdrawal. And all of it has this underlying goal: controlling or dominating the victim to preserve the perpetrator's own sense of superiority or safety.
So when we say indirect, we mean things that just don't look like abuse to someone watching from the outside.
Precisely. What makes it covert is that it's often packaged in ways that can even look loving or caring.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it might be delivered as just, normal relationship talk. I'm only saying this because I care about you, or it's for your own good, or maybe framed as a simple joke. Can't you take a joke? Or even disguised as protectiveness.
So it gets mixed in with normal life.
Exactly. And because it's often mixed with periods of genuine charm or generosity, an outside observer, or sometimes even the victim themselves, finds it incredibly hard to detect or clearly label as abuse.
So it doesn't fit the usual definition of abuse, the kind that might involve clear aggression or obvious harm?
Right. SCA often exists below the threshold upon which others take serious action. And that invisibility is key to its profoundly damaging, pervasive nature. The behavior just gets normalized within the relationship.
And slowly erodes the victim's reality.
Slowly, over time. It makes it incredibly confusing for the victim. They have no visible injury, often no single clear moment of malice to point to, and frequently no external validation for their feelings of distress, confusion, or anxiety. They just know they constantly feel small or wrong or anxious. Okay, so this deep dive into the brain, I think it's crucial here. If NPD is characterized by this core empathy deficit and this constant, almost defensive focus on the self, we really need to understand the internal wiring. You know, what dictates this self-centered processing? What's the basic neurobiological mechanism that limits the ability to truly connect effectively with other people?
Right, we're moving from the outward behavior to the actual hardware inside. Where does this whole empathy processing thing even start in the brain?
Well, it seems to kick off in what neuroscientists often call the core empathy network. The main brain structures that coordinate both the feeling part and the understanding part of empathy. The affective and cognitive bits seem to be the anterior insula, AI, the anterior cingulate cortex, ACC, and also specific areas of the medial prefrontal cortex, MPFC.
Okay, the anterior insula and the anterior cingulate cortex. I've heard those mentioned a lot regarding like emotional awareness and making decisions.
They are absolutely critical hubs. Specifically, the AI and the ACC are central nodes in a bigger system known as the salience network, SN.
A salience network, okay.
Think of the salience network as maybe the brain's chief coordinator. Its main job is to sift through the constant flood of incoming information and figure out what the brain should pay attention to right now.
It decides what's important, what's salient.
Exactly. It selects and coordinates the flow of information, whether that's coming from inside your body, like feeling hungry or pain or anxiety, or from outside stimuli, like seeing someone cry or hearing an argument nearby.
Okay, got it.
And within this network, the right anterior insula, RAI, is thought to be the critical hub, maybe like a dynamic switchboard operator, managing a tension between two huge, often competing cognitive processing systems.
Okay, two big systems. Which ones?
These are the Central Executive Network, CEN,
Yeah.
and the Default Mode Network, DMN.
Right, CEN and DMN. We definitely need to spend a moment here because this sounds key to understanding the narcissistic brain you described. Can we break those down clearly?
Absolutely. So the Central Executive Network, CEN, is all about external focus and getting tasks done effectively. This is your doing mode.
Okay.
It focuses on solving problems, concentrating on a job, planning something, engaging with the world outside you. It involves brain areas like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It needs you to focus externally and kind of tune out internal distractions.
So the minute I focus on driving or reading something complicated, my CEN is firing up.
That's exactly right. Then you have the Default Mode Network, DMN. This network gets really active when you're not focused on an external task.
When your mind wanders.
Precisely. It's involved in self-reflective stuff, thinking about your past or the future, analyzing yourself, daydreaming, what we often just call mind wandering, because its focus is internal memory, self-thoughts, monitoring how you feel inside this network is sometimes called the neural basis of the self.
Okay, so in a, let's say, typical brain, the salience network, using that RAI switch, lets us shift focus smoothly. If my partner starts talking to me, the switch moves me from my internal DMN thoughts to the external CEN engagement.
That's the healthy function, yes. The salience network's job is to dynamically shift attention based on what's needed. If a task needs external focus, it dampens down the DMN and ramps up the CEN. If you need internal reflection, it flips the switch the other way.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, as you said earlier. If the RAI is the switch, the research suggests that in people with narcissistic traits, that switch is faulty. How does that actually work?
Yeah, this is where the model gets fascinating.
Yeah.
Research strongly suggests that in narcissistic persons, let's call them NPs, there's a significant dysfunction in this whole RAI salience network system.
Okay.
The theoretical model proposes there's faulty switching between the CEN and the DMN, and this dysfunction seems to lead to a systemic, preferential, maybe almost constant increase in DMN activation.
Meaning their attention is just overwhelmingly stuck on themselves, their needs, their image, their worries.
That's a great way to put it. Like their brain is perpetually running this intensive self-monitoring software in the background, and it's hogging all the processing power. They can't easily close the program.
Wow.
The internal stimuli in MP's thoughts focused on the self, needing validation, checking their image, monitoring for threats, seem to constantly activate the RAI. Now, the RAI itself plays a big role in representing the self. So if it's already swamped, representing the self or processing internal needs.
It doesn't have the capacity left over for external stuff.
Exactly. It struggles to properly process external affective stimuli. If that self-monitoring program is always running maxed out, the system just can't handle demanding external input, like seeing someone else in deep emotional pain.
So processing someone else's pain or strong emotions requires the RAI to shift focus away from the self and onto the other person. But if the network is kind of structurally biased towards this self-focused DMN, then external empathy, that affective sharing we talked about, becomes physiologically blocked, or at least extremely difficult to access. They literally might not have the neurological bandwidth for someone else's feelings at that moment.
That's the essence of the model. It goes beyond just a personality choice. It seems to be a difference in how information processing is prioritized at a very basic level. For the NP, the self is almost always the highest priority signal.
Okay.
So when they are confronted with strong external emotion, like their partner crying, that emotion seems to trigger two critical consequences related to distress, and neither of them is really compassion.
Okay, what are those consequences?
Well, the first is that when NPs face other stress, say, their partner is genuinely upset, their inability to clearly separate their own feelings from the other person's means. The result isn't genuine compassion or affective sharing. Instead, it triggers increased personal distress.
Personal distress, meaning they feel bad.
Yes, it's a purely self-oriented feeling of anxiety, unease, negative arousal.
Yeah.
They feel uncomfortable around the sad person, not necessarily because they share the sadness, but because the display of strong emotion is causing them negative feelings, making them feel bad or anxious.
So they feel anxious because the situation is stressful, which probably just confirms to them that it's a bad situation, and they turn inward even more to protect themselves.
That seems to be the dynamic. And the second consequence involved threat detection, which brings us right back to your opening story about the dinner party.
Oh, okay.
The RAI is a crucial high-alert structure in the human threat detection system. Because of this potential DMN dysfunction and the constant internal focus, it's hypothesized that NPs might have an abnormal evaluation of external emotional stimuli as threatening. Meaning things like disagreement, contradiction, or even just someone else expressing vulnerability or need might get processed incredibly quickly as a potential danger to their fragile sense of self.
Okay, hang on. I need a second with that. That means their internal alarm bell might actually ring when their spouse just gently corrects them about when they bought the house. That changes, well, everything about how we see that reaction.
It really does. That ice-cold look you described, the dismissal. It wasn't necessarily a cold, calculated choice to be cruel in that instant. It could have been the external sign of a neurobiological system perceiving a minor factual correction as an immediate threat that needed to be shut down or dismissed instantly to protect that fragile self.
The self-preservation switch got flipped because the system is hypersensitive.
That's the idea. The system is hypersensitive to perceived threats against the self.
And logically, if the RAI is busy sounding the threat alarm, it's definitely not going to be encouraging helpful behaviors like consoling someone or apologizing.
Precisely. This prolonged activation of the threat system likely messes with the proper recognition of the actual threat level. It registers a gentle correction as if it were a major attack. And this high alert status naturally discourages any helping behavior towards someone who is, in that moment, being perceived, even mistakenly, as a source of threat or insecurity.
Which perfectly explains that pattern. The instant switch from charm to cold dismissal, and then maybe a quick return to charm once the perceived threat, the wife's contradiction, has been neutralized or shut down.
It aligns very well with that observable pattern, yes.
This has huge implications for treatment, doesn't it? If this disorder is partly rooted in faulty neurological switching, then therapy needs to tackle not just the learned behaviors, but maybe the very mechanisms of attention shifting and how threats are evaluated.
It's a massive clinical challenge.
Yeah.
You know, if NPs really are highly sensitive to personal distress, maybe resembling some traits seen in certain types of psychopathy due to this extended RAI activation, well, future research really needs to explore how we might enhance top-down inhibition.
Top-down inhibition, meaning?
Meaning using higher cognitive functions like reasoning or perspective taking to consciously override or modulate that intense emotional arousal coming from the overactive RAI. The goal would be to help them shift focus from "this feels bad to me" towards recognizing this other person is in distress.
But overcoming that inherent brain bias towards the self-focus loop sounds incredibly difficult.
It's a staggering task, honestly. But understanding the neurobiology gives us potential targets, even if they are very challenging ones.
Okay, so we've got this neurobiological model emerging where the brain seems kind of structurally predisposed to prioritize the self, maybe even treat emotional demands from others as threats. But this wiring doesn't just appear out of nowhere, right? It develops. How does that disorder actually take root? We need to look at the developmental origins, especially the role of adverse childhood experiences, or ACs.
Right. The development of pathological narcissism isn't down to just one single thing. It's understood as a really complex interplay between, say, genetic predispositions and environmental factors.
Nature and nurture.
Exactly. But the accumulation of psychosocial risk factors, and particularly adverse childhood experiences, ACs, is consistently seen as probably the primary risk factor for developing NPD in adulthood.
And when we talk about ACEs, we're talking about significant negative events in childhood, like abuse, neglect, serious household dysfunction.
Yes, precisely those things. Experiencing multiple ACEs like chronic abuse or severe emotional neglect is associated with actual physical changes, including impaired brain development, structural and functional abnormalities in the brain.
Affecting things like the RAI we just discussed.
Potentially, yes. And critically, it's linked to impaired emotional regulation, which directly impacts that RAI function.
Yeah.
And perhaps most importantly, it often results in a profoundly damaged sense of self-worth at the core.
Okay, but ACEs are sadly quite common. Why don't all people who experience trauma become narcissistic? What's the specific environmental piece, the trigger maybe, that steers trauma towards NPD rather than, say, borderline personality traits or chronic depression or something else?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it points towards that gene-environment interaction and maybe the specific type of parental or caregiver response to the child, especially around the trauma. It seems it's not just the trauma itself, but the relationship dynamic around the trauma that shapes the specific defense mechanism the child develops.
Okay.
And this is where we start to see potentially distinct paths leading towards those two different presentations of narcissism we talked about earlier, the vulnerable and the grandiose.
Right. Let's look at the origins of the vulnerable type first. How does that develop?
So vulnerable narcissism seems strongly associated with more classic, clear-cut ACEs, things like childhood neglect and physical or emotional abuse.
Okay.
This kind of environment sends a pretty consistent message to the child. You're unworthy, your needs don't matter, your feelings are wrong, or you might even be actively harmed for expressing them. This leads to this core internalized sense of shame, inferiority, powerlessness, and often a tendency toward submissiveness or anxious withdrawal later on.
Which fits that vulnerable, introverted presentation we discussed. They internalize the sense of being flawed and become really anxious about their own competence, their ability to cope.
Exactly. Now, grandiose narcissism, interestingly, is often linked to a more complicated, almost paradoxical pattern of parenting. Specifically, parental overvaluation.
Overvaluation, like spoiling them.
It can look like that,
Right.
but it's more complex. The child is excessively pampered, maybe idealized, told constantly they're uniquely special, brilliant, destined for greatness.
That sounds positive on the surface.
It does, but here's the catch. This overvaluation is frequently mixed with really inconsistent parenting, maybe severe criticism for not meeting those high expectations or very conditional attention. Love and validation are only given when the child performs or achieves.
Ah, okay. So it creates this inflated but incredibly fragile persona. They learn they're special, but only if they keep winning, keep performing.
Exactly. Love becomes like a performance review. And that combination of unrealistic praise alongside intense conditional pressure and criticism creates this profound psychological conflict for the child.
I can see that.
Social developmental theory suggests that these grandiose self-states then develop as a powerful defense mechanism. Since genuine unconditional love feels unavailable or unreliable, the child constructs this perfect, idealized internal version of themselves, the grand self.
An internal shield.
Yes, a shield.
Yeah.
This defense allows them to try and satisfy their own needs for safety and worth independently, or maybe just to dissociate, to mentally escape from an abusive or highly conditional stressful reality.
They build this armor of superiority to hide the deep fear that if they stop performing, if they show any flaw, they'll be utterly rejected or worthless.
That's the idea. And the long-term result is that highly dominating, self-centered, exhibitionistic need for grandiosity we see in adults. They become dependent on external validation, what's called narcissistic supply, just to keep that constructed, perfect self afloat. Because the real, authentic internal self feels crippled by the earlier neglect or the conditional pressure.
We have a really powerful case study that seems to illustrate this devastating mix perfectly. The overvaluation combined with emotional neglect, leading to severe adult pathology.
Let's maybe analyze the case of the 75-year-old retired Vietnamese man in a bit more detail.
Yes, this case is almost a textbook example of how that specific environmental mix can shape the pathology. So this man, he was born into one of the wealthiest families in former Saigon. A very privileged start, which seems to have initiated that pattern of idealization.
Right.
His early life involved clear parental overvaluation. His mother explicitly told him he was special, unusual, and destined for greatness. This planted the initial seeds of entitlement and grandiosity. Okay, so the special message was there early, but then the neglect came in. That provided the trauma needed to really solidify that grandiose defense.
It seems so. At age 10, during the war, he was sent away to live with an uncle for 5 years. And while his basic physical needs were apparently met, he described experiencing severe emotional neglect during that time.
Right.
He explicitly told the clinicians evaluating him that his uncle offered no love. He felt completely isolated. And when he eventually returned home after those 5 years, he said he felt like a stranger. This intense emotional isolation seems to have compounded that earlier pattern of conditional attention or overvaluation. His constructed special identity might have been the only thing he felt he had left to cling to during those years of profound neglect.
And the outcome, decades later when he was assessed, a classic pervasive NPD presentation.
Absolutely. He fulfilled all 9 diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5 for NPD. He exhibited extreme grandiosity, believing his wisdom and enlightenment actually exceeded that of the Buddha, and that he was such a gifted singer that he set the standard too high for his friends to even try to compete. That's a clear echo of being told he was special and destined for greatness.
And this grandiosity was paired with the entitlement and lack of empathy.
Rigidly so. It was exemplified by his statements about his family.
What did he say?
He stated quite clearly, "I only think of myself and how I can enjoy my remaining years. It is my daughter's duty to take care of me, and it is my wife's responsibility to provide for all my essential needs."
Oof, that's stark.
It is. It shows the grandiosity of the overvalued child, completely fused with the emotional withdrawal and self-focus of the neglected child. He sees his family purely as extensions of his own needs, instruments for his comfort, not as individuals deserving reciprocal care or empathy.
That trajectory really shows how that initial, maybe highly conditional overvaluation, when combined with intense, isolating emotional neglect, can forge this pathological grandiosity as a lifelong defense. And this brings us back to the core wound, doesn't it?
It really does. The key takeaway, I think, from exploring these developmental roots is that despite the vastly different outward appearances, the charming, grandiose host, the quiet, vulnerable type, the overtly entitled man in the case study, the fundamental internalized core belief driving all of them seems to be the same, deep down.
Which is?
Something along the lines of, I don't matter, I am fundamentally flawed, I am unlovable. Whether they choose to bury that belief by fighting their way into the spotlight, demanding narcissistic supply, or by sacrificing their own needs entirely and demanding pity or care through vulnerability, the deep developmental wound seems identical.
So the grandiose person weaponizes their needs, maybe, while the vulnerable person sacrifices theirs but becomes passive-aggressively demanding.
That's a plausible way to look at the different strategies stemming from the same core wound, yes.
And understanding these patterns, how these parenting styles might get passed down, the intergenerational transmission of these traits that feels essential if there's any hope for prevention or more effective treatment. We're ultimately trying to heal a profound childhood wound that's manifesting as adult relational violence.
Exactly. Addressing the developmental roots is key to understanding the persistence and the depth of the problem.
Okay, so if narcissistic behavior is being fueled by this deep-seated developmental insecurity, and it's channeled through a brain that seems to default to self-obsession and threat detection, how does this actually translate into that day-to-day psychological warfare experienced by partners and family, like the wife at the dinner party? We need to move from the theory now to the actual tactics. Let's analyze the specific behaviors involved in subtle covert abuse and the invisible damage they inflict.
Right. When researchers gather stories from survivors of these kinds of relationships, the specific behaviors they describe are often really subtle, maybe hard to categorize individually until you start synthesizing them.
Seeing the patterns.
Exactly. Researchers have managed to group these pervasive covert behaviors into roughly 3 distinct categories. These really illustrate the insidious nature of SCA.
Okay, what are those key groupings? What defines this battlefield of covert abuse?
They're generally categorized as undermining, limiting, and withholding. These three buckets seem to cover the vast majority of that subtle, non-physical psychological violence.
Let's start with undermining. That sounds like it gets right to the core problem, destroying the victim's connection to their own reality.
Absolutely. Undermining includes a whole suite of behaviors designed specifically to destroy the victim's credibility, their trust in themselves, and their very perception of reality. The goal is often what's called epistemic control, controlling what the victim knows and believes about themselves and the world.
And the tactics used here are common.
Ubiquitous in these dynamics.
Can you give us some concrete examples? How does this actually play out in a conversation?
Okay, think about discounting or minimizing feelings. The victim expresses genuine hurt or distress, and the perpetrator replies with something like, "Oh, you're overreacting," or "It was just a joke, lighten up," or "Why are you always so sensitive?"
Which immediately shifts the blame onto the victim's reaction, not the perpetrator's action.
Instantly. Then there's negation, which is often referred to as gaslighting. This is denying that an event even happened, or adamantly denying they said something hurtful that the victim clearly remembers.
Like, that never happened. You must be imagining things.
Exactly. Or, "I never promised you that. You must have misunderstood." It forces the victim to constantly question their own memory, their own sanity.
Yeah, that's incredibly destabilizing.
Very much so. We also see heavy use of projection or accusation. This is where the perpetrator basically blames the victim for their own faults or feelings.
How does that work?
Well, for example, if the narcissist is being unfaithful, they might constantly accuse their partner of flirting or cheating. If they're emotionally cold and withdrawn, they might accuse the partner of being too needy or demanding.
Wow.
And finally, undermining, there's persistent negative labeling and underestimating. Constantly telling the victim things like, "You're just not smart enough for that job," or "You always mess things up," or consistently dismissing their achievements or competence.
Death by 1,000 cuts.
And these acts are so often mixed with positive behaviors, that's part of what makes it so confusing. The perpetrator might give a seemingly sincere compliment just moments before delivering a crushing minimization or criticism.
Leaving the victim perpetually off balance, disoriented. Okay, let's move to the second grouping, limiting. How do these control tactics show up subtly in daily life?
Limiting behaviors are really designed to restrict the victim's agency, their autonomy, their attention span, essentially forcing the entire relationship dynamic to revolve exclusively around the perpetrator's needs, feelings, and fragility. This often includes intense use of guilt tripping, making the victim feel solely responsible for the perpetrator's happiness, or lack thereof, or their success.
Like saying, "If you really loved me, you wouldn't want to go out with your friends tonight because you know I've had a hard day."
A perfect classic example. Limiting also includes making the partner focus only on the perpetrator and their problems, often to the exclusion of the partner's own life, goals, or needs.
So the partner's world shrinks.
It does. There's often a constant, subtle violation of boundaries, things like reading private messages, checking emails, maybe showing up unexpectedly at their work, but it's all framed as caring or just being concerned.
Right, control disguised as care.
And perhaps most crucially, under limiting, they will often actively work to prevent the partner from developing or maintaining their own interests, friendships, or close relationships outside of the abuser. They slowly isolate the victim.
Cutting off support systems.
Exactly. It's like an attempt to colonize the victim's entire life and identity, removing any external sources of validation, perspective, or reality checking that might challenge the perpetrator's narrative.
That's deeply controlling. Okay, and the final category, withholding. This seems like it ties directly back to that emotional neglect we discussed in the developmental section, the kind that might have contributed to the narcissist's own issues.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
And it is often the ultimate withdrawal tactic. Studies actually suggest it can be the most psychologically devastating form of SEA for many victims.
Really? More than undermining?
For some, yes.
Yeah.
Withholding involves behaviors like being persistently moody, sulky, or passive-aggressive. This forces the victim into a constant state of anxiety, trying to guess what's wrong, trying to fix the unfixable mood.
Walking on eggshells.
Constantly. It includes overt physical or emotional withdrawal, giving the silent treatment, refusing to engage in conversation, creating an emotional vacuum in the home. And most critically, it manifests as a chronic, pervasive lack of concern, attention, support, or appreciation.
That sounds like the daily experience of just feeling completely unseen, unloved, invisible in your own relationship.
That's exactly what survivors describe. One study, specifically looking at women who experienced this pattern of abuse, found that this kind of emotional neglect, the daily drip, drip, drip of lack of affection, lack of support, lack of appreciation, was reported as the most distressing form of covert abuse they endured.
Oh.
This withdrawal can become the absolute norm in the relationship. It can lead the victim to confuse the mere absence of conflict. The narcissist isn't actively raging with the presence of actual love or connection. Or they internalize it, feeling that the lack of attention must mean they are fundamentally unworthy of it.
Okay, this leads us to the really critical question. If SCA leaves no visible marks, why is it reported to be so damaging? Some studies even suggest it can be as harmful as, or sometimes even more harmful than, overt psychological abuse or even physical abuse. How can invisible violence be more destructive?
It seems the severity is tied mainly to two factors. Its chronicity and the profound self-doubt it creates. Overt violence, while terrifying and awful, often provides a grim kind of clarity. There might be an injury, maybe a witness, a definable moment of transgression you can point to.
It's undeniable.
Subtle abuse, on the other hand, is more like a chronic, low-grade infection. It's a constant stressor, but it's perpetually confusing. And as we said, it's often mixed with positive behaviors. The charming host, the helpful spouse moments, which prevents the victim from establishing a firm, clear reality that they are, in fact, being systematically abused.
So it's not one big traumatic event. It's the constant slow-motion erosion of the self, day after day.
Precisely. SCA is fundamentally described by some researchers as an attitude change process inflicted on the victim. The continuous undermining, the limiting, the withholding it systematically erodes the victim's ability to trust their own judgment, their own feelings, their own perceptions. This leads to profound reality bending and self-doubt.
And the consequences of that are?
Staggering, frankly. It undermines a person's core sense of self. It leads to intense self-blame, chronic confusion, a pervasive loss of security and trust, not just in the abuser, but often in themselves and others too. They might develop a deep belief that they have a flawed personality, that they are the problem, and it reinforces any pre-existing vulnerabilities or feelings of unimportance they might have had.
They lose access to their own intuition, their own gut feelings.
Completely. Their internal compass gets broken.
And we know this kind of invisible emotional harm often shows up physically, right?
Yes, absolutely. The chronic, invisible stress inherent in SCA, that feeling of constant threat to the self, the inability to ever feel safe or secure in the relationship, very often translates into somatic symptoms.
Physical illnesses.
Physical illnesses that stem from the ongoing emotional trauma. Victims frequently show up at their doctor's office with things like chronic anxiety, deep depression, unexplained headaches, persistent gastrointestinal problems, chronic fatigue, autoimmune issues sometimes. The body is essentially screaming the harm that the mind is struggling to name or get validated for.
Which points directly to a massive public health challenge, doesn't it? If the harm is severe but largely invisible, and the victim themselves is often confused and full of self-doubt, how on earth are they supposed to get acknowledgement, let alone support?
It's a huge problem. The lack of public awareness, and even professional awareness sometimes, about SCA is a significant barrier. Clinicians, therapists, doctors, nurses, anyone in a helping profession really needs to be educated to recognize these subtle patterns. They need to be vigilant for the possibility that physical symptoms might be the result of this kind of covert abuse.
And complicating matters, the narcissist is often incredibly skilled at maintaining that perfect deception, especially for professionals, right? Which just reinforces the victim's isolation and confusion.
Exactly. It's sadly common for the abusive partner to present to outsiders, doctors, therapists, even friends and family as entirely reasonable, maybe deferential, helpful, deeply concerned about the victim's mysterious illness or their overreactions or anxiety.
Playing the concerned partner.
Expertly. They hide their true behavior brilliantly, which creates even more isolation for the victim, who might now feel subtly undermined or disbelieved by the very professionals they turn to for help.
So for victims to even begin healing, to start pushing back against that reality bending, they desperately need external validation, someone to see it and name it.
Desperately. Clinicians have a vital role here. They need to be able to recognize and name the abuse, to educate clients about these subtle patterns of SCA and really facilitate the client's own recognition of what's been happening. That validation is often the first crucial step towards regaining their sense of reality, rebuilding that broken internal compass. The invisibility of the violence is the perpetrator's greatest weapon, and bringing it into the light through awareness and validation is really the only effective countermeasure. We started this deep dive with that fleeting moment you described at the dinner party, that look of cold dismissal that leaves no visible trace. What we've sort of uncovered is that this moment isn't just random cruelty. It seems to be the instantaneous external manifestation of an internal, maybe neurologically driven self-preservation system, a system that's structurally prioritizing the self over any kind of external relational processing, especially when challenged.
Right. And this internal system, which seems born out of these deep developmental wounds, things like early emotional neglect or that confusing conditional validation, it defaults to this hyper-focus on the self. So when that fragile self feels challenged, even on a tiny point effect like a house purchase date, the compromised neural switch seems to register that disagreement not as just a simple error, but potentially as an immediate threat to an unstable identity, a threat that has to be neutralized right now.
Exactly. And the resulting behavior, what we've been calling subtle covert abuse, is that pattern of insidious, often invisible acts. The undermining, the limiting, the withholding. These acts seem designed, consciously or unconsciously, to maintain control and dominate the victim through psychological means. And ultimately, they lead to those devastating consequences. The chronic self-doubt, the reality bending, and the profound emotional and sometimes physical harm for the person on the receiving end.
The very invisibility of this psychological violence makes it extraordinarily difficult to recognize, let alone combat. It really demands a deeper understanding of its neurological core, its complex developmental history, just to fully grasp the profound scope of the harm it inflicts, often silently, within individuals and across family structures.